Thank you very much. Thank you, Connie, and thank you to Vroman's, my favorite bookstore in the world. Seriously, my wife and I live in Burbank, and I often say that we weekend in Pasadena, and you can usually find me in the history section, camped out there. If you're ever here on the weekends and you see a strange person lurking around, that's probably me, because I'm completely obsessed with this bookstore, and I support it, and I love what Vroman's does. I had to look up gimlet in the dictionary when I got that review. I thought it was like a drink. It was a giblet or whatever. I think it's sharp. I don't know. I had to look at the derivation of it. It's like Middle English or something. I don't even know. Yeah, it was a very nice review. You should tell that to the guy who wrote the blog post about me recently, who called me an idiot. But anyway, that's a whole other story. So thank you all very much for coming out. This is a real pleasure to speak in front of a crowd of readers and a crowd of Vroman's supporters. I'd like to tell you a little bit about how this book started, where I got the idea to do this. And the real origin of the book was when I was in college. And I spent my junior year abroad. I had gotten the acting bug, and I really wanted to be, like the next Kenneth Branagh. And so I went to London, and I studied Shakespeare. And I completely fell head over heels in love with Shakespeare. And when I came back, I thought, I can do this. I can make a living. I felt more alive when I was speaking his language than when I did anything else in my life. And I thought, what a great way to make a living, to be a Shakespearean actor. And so what I did was audition for a local Renaissance fair near my hometown of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I got cast. I was so excited. I got cast as Romeo in Romeo and Juliet. And so I went to the Renaissance fair on the first day, and I was there in my doublet and hose and my codpiece, all excited. And I found out at that moment that Romeo and Juliet at the Renaissance fair had been shrunk to half an hour. It was the truncated version, the greatest hits of Romeo and Juliet. So it wasn't quite the RSC, or the National Theatre, which I had experienced this wonderful year that I had in London. And so at the Renaissance Fair, what you do is you inhabit a character, and you walk around and you talk to people, and you act like you're this Elizabethan. Well, I didn't know that I was really getting into any of this, but I was. And I was always amazed, always intrigued by seeing people show up to the fair dressed as Elizabethans. They were knights in shining armor. They were ladies in dresses. And I always wondered, why are they doing that? I'm getting paid $150 a week to dress up as an Elizabethan, and they're doing it voluntarily. And it always struck me as something that was very curious. What is it about dressing up as an historical figure, as an historical character, that appeals to people? And that stayed with me. I always wondered, what was the attraction, and why specifically are people attracted to a certain moment in time? They weren't dressing up as Romans. They weren't dressing up as French and Indian War reenactors. They were dressing up as Elizabethans. What is it about a moment in time that attracts us? Why are some people attracted to a moment in time? So I think I'm one of the few people in the United States who can say I grew up in a log cabin, which is true. I grew up in a log cabin. It was built in 1740, and I grew up next to Amish people. I really do think I'm maybe one of the very few people who can say that. And I never really thought anything of this. This is just my normal life. I'm growing up in this house with crooked floorboards and dead mice underneath them, and it smells at times, and it's mildewy, and the people down the street have no electricity. This was, the 1970s, the 1980s, but of course I didn't think anything of it. This was my life. I wanted to get away from that life. I wanted to go to the big city. I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to see tall buildings and glass skyscrapers and have an exciting life. And so I did that. I went to New York, and then I moved to Los Angeles in 2003. And one of the things about moving to LA from the East Coast when you're 30 years old is that all of a sudden you feel very divorced from this East Coast sort of traditional upbringing. And that happened to me when I came out here. I was living in a part of the city that felt very new. It dated back really kind of to the 1950s. And I felt very detached all of a sudden. That thing that I took for granted, growing up in the log cabin, living next to Amish people, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, I needed that in my life. And so one day I was in the shower, loofahing, And my wife bursts into the bathroom and says, just out of nowhere, she said, if you could go back to college right now and major in any subject, what would it be? And I'm like, well, that's a good question, actually. What would I do? And I just burst out history. And as I said it, even as I said it, I didn't quite put all the pieces together. I didn't quite understand what it was that I felt was missing in my life, that I needed to learn about the past, that this would somehow make me a better person, maybe, and a better citizen. And so, not that long afterwards, we went down to Old Fort MacArthur. I don't know if anybody here has ever been there, but it's on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. It's an old fort, and in early July, actually just last weekend, 2 weekends ago rather, they hold what's called a timeline event. And a timeline event is where reenactors from all different time periods show up. They encamp at the old fort, they set up their tents, they show their weapons, they dress up in their uniforms, and they talk about their particular moment in time. And so my wife and I went to this, and I was just amazed, because I didn't know that the reenactment hobby was so broad. I didn't realize that people, dressed up as Romans at that time, or that there were Celts out there, or that there were people dressed up as Vikings, and all these other different time periods. And when I was there, I noticed that there was one particular group that was not there. And so when I went home, I started Googling, and I was on my bed with my laptop sort of propped up on my knees, and I typed Nazi reenactment into Google. And I got about as far as Nazi re, and the predictive search yielded 3 results: Nazi reenactment uniforms, and Nazi reenactors. And I was like, oh my God, people do this. And it's on the internet. They share their hobby with the world. And so after a little bit more searching, I discovered this website. And it was called driveonstalingrad.com. And this was the website for an upcoming reenactment. And it was a fascinating website. I mean, they had all the rules, they had all these photos, and I couldn't tell if the photos were real or whether they were staged. They were that good. And so I sent them an email. And I said, hey, I live in Los Angeles, I'm this writer guy, can I come play along? And they said, sure. And so that's the first chapter. It's called Sleepless in Stalingrad, because I was sleepless the entire time. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to the plains of Colorado. There's nothing there. I think I saw the entire time I was there was like a tree and a bird. It's very flat, and it's very cold. I was there in October, and for those of you who know anything about Stalingrad and about this battle, this was one of the most horrific battles of all time. I mean, the estimates are somewhere between 1 and 2 million people that died over 7 months. Stalin was just throwing whoever he could at the Germans, and Hitler kept trying to advance, and they just hated each other's guts, and it was just bloody and awful, and people were freezing to death, and their body parts were clinging to metal, and it was just, it's horrible. It's terrible. And so these guys thought, fun weekend. So we did a forced march. I was dressed as a German. My last name is Schroeder, slightly uncomfortable. I looked down at one point, saw a small swastika on my right breast pocket. I thought, interesting. So I have never been through basic training. I have never served in our military. I, at the time, probably weighed 20 pounds more than I weigh now. I was not in shape to do this, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And so we made it about 6 miles. The plan was that we were going to stop and spend the night in this shuttered one-room schoolhouse that was atop this high plain. And the temperature was dropping fast. The night before, it had dropped to 20 degrees, and we didn't have sleeping bags because we were going to be authentic. I hadn't slept. The mixture of being in the presence of 70, 90 snoring, farting men and the frigid temperatures, I didn't sleep a wink. And so I, at this point in the story, I have not slept in 36 hours. The sun has set. I'm lying in the middle of this one-room schoolhouse next to a swept-up pile of rat droppings. And I miss my wife. I think at this time I decided that I would never complain about another thing as long as I live. And I think that I've